Good morning, students. Our next tutorial is going to focus on the role of Sun Yat-sen from the period of 1912 to 1924 and his key role in the growth of nationalism over this period. So you already should have a fairly decent understanding of the period, and we're looking at the kind of early Republican period and into the kind of what's known as the warlord era. So during this period, obviously, we have, first of all, the rise of Yuan Shikai and the First Republic. This then collapses as Yuan Shikai attempts to reform and rebuild a constitutional monarchy and put himself as the emperor. After his death, we have the period known as the warlord era, in which we have a very fractured China, provincial leaders controlled by different warlords in these different provinces. And this then obviously leads up until we have this, again, this boost of national, pride and national call after the May the 4th movement. And throughout the New Culture movement, we have lots of Western ideas coming into China. Many intellectuals are starting to explore things like democracy, self-determination, sovereignty, as well as other more communist, socialist ideas inspired from Russia. So, China in this period is a real kind of hotbed of different intellectual thought, competing different interests. Different forces are all trying to attempt to kind of rebuild their own aims. So we're going to kind of focus today's lesson on Sun Yat-sen's kind of role in the period. But make sure that if you haven't watched the other videos, make sure you go back and make sure you get a clear understanding of the period first before continuing with the future tutorials. And so our key inquiry question for today's lesson is what did Sun Yat-sen do to promote nationalism? What is his role? What is his contribution to what will become the birth of the Nationalist Party, and how does he provide a platform for them to come into power? So just to rewind a bit, post the 1911 revolution, which was successful in removing the Qing dynasty, the Manchus are finally have been removed from power, and the first Chinese elections are held. Sun Yat-sen wins 94% of the electoral votes in December. However, his power is very limited to the southern regions of China. We're looking around the sort of Guangzhou area. And in order to kind of secure the security of this new republic, he decides to give power to one of the key generals in the Beiyang clique, and that is Yuan Shikai. As I mentioned, the Nationalist Party kind of lacked broader support, fairly still very much localized, and they didn't have the resources, namely the army, in order to kind of expand their power. And so what does Sun Yat-sen do? He is very wary of the fragility of this early republic. And so he asks Yuan Shikai to come to Nanjing, to change capital from Beijing to Nanjing. Sun Yat-sen believes that if he does this, he can help to exert a bit more influence on Yuan Shikai and have a bit more of a key role in framing the kind of political direction of China. Yuan Shikai is very much aware of this. His power base is in Beijing, and so he doesn't want to move the capital. He knows that he'd be much more kind of, he wouldn't have as much strength from moving from his kind of power base. And so there's, early tension between the kind of two leaders. The Kuomintang at this time as well continued to operate in secret, and they lacked kind of broader understanding of the democratic principles. So you can see in this early poster, we have the Chinese Republic forever, long live the Republic of China. This republic would last for a very, very short period of time because, as we know, Yuan Shikai would attempt to restore imperial rule. So this kind of early troubles between Sun Yat-sen and Yuan Shikai leads to further revolutions and further conflict. Song Jiarun is assassinated, a key sort of Kuomintang leader. And there's deepening disputes because of Yuan Shikai's policies to further give in to kind of foreign intervention. And he signs $100 million worth of loans in 1913, okay, with the banking consortium of foreign nations, which includes Japan, the US, Britain, France. So again, we see, okay, China being kind of carved up by these foreign powers. And this was meant to be, the birth of the Republic was meant to be the push for China to become sovereign, independent of foreign nations, okay, and try to boost kind of national pride. And so the nationalists kind of compared Yuan Shikai to the old Manchus, okay, continued to compromise Chinese sovereignty, and they called for his impeachment. And this leads Yuan Shikai to march south, okay, against the Kuomintang. You can see in a series of conflicts, okay, the GMD is unsuccessful. They are no match for the much larger forces of the Republic, and so their armies are disbanded, their supporters are killed, and their leaders are removed from power. And during this time, Yuan Shikai simply bribes provincial officials to support him, and so his power is still very provincial. He doesn't have central authority at all. He doesn't have absolute control over China, at all. And so after the failure of the Second Revolution, we have Sun Yat-sen fleeing China, okay, to travel back to Japan, okay, in an attempt to kind of reorganize the party. During his time in Japan, he drew support from the variety of different nationalist groups that were also taking kind of, were exiled to Japan. So he draws upon national groups from the Philippines, from Taiwan, from Southeast Asia, and starts to lecture, discuss, okay, and build kind of intellectual support for the rebuilding of the Chinese Republic. The revolutionary groups in Japan sought true liberation from foreign powers. Okay, this is a kind of a similarity that binds them together. So even though Japan at this time is very much looking to expand their power, highly militaristic, okay, expansionary foreign policy, and they're looking to carve off their own elements of China. Members of these revolutionary groups were, not in support of these very militaristic Japanese foreign policy. And they called for a united kind of pan-Asian coalition to combat Western influence. So Sun drew supporters from Japanese intellectuals. Okay, you can see a few of them pictured here. But he was unable to exert broader influence on the Japanese parliament, known as the Diet. So he was unable to kind of convince them to support him in removing the warlords, okay, and rebuilding the Chinese Republic. And there remained a persisting view in Japan that the chronic weaknesses of China was an opportunity for exploitation, okay, that Japanese society at this time is highly racialized, and they viewed themselves as greater than that of the Chinese. And they thought that, okay, well, if this chronic weaknesses and this, political fragmentation, okay, they should not be allowed to rule. And therefore, we should bring order, we should bring stability, we should bring our own kind of political organization to China in order to rebuild them. And, that was their motivation to expand, and also with regards to, economic, gains that would become with China as well. So after, further failed revolutions, he's then also exiled, okay, from Japan because he starts to exert kind of more influence. He starts to try and, gain weapons in order to launch further uprisings. So Japan kind of says that, you can't come back here. So Sun returns to China in 1917. And he sets up a rival government in Guangzhou to challenge the Republican regime in Beijing. He has limited success. Again, fairly localized, fairly provincial, doesn't exert much kind of central authority at all. And so he moves to Shanghai, okay, a much bigger city, further, north, and he drew upon the kind of conditions of the time that were created after the May the 4th movement. We know that this is a huge kind of call for national sovereignty, for independence, okay, for the end of foreign imperialism after Shandong is given to the Japanese, which was meant to be promised to the Chinese. And he also sought support from expatriate Chinese to contribute funds, okay, and he then returned home to his province and continued instability, okay, in China, as well as the growth of the new culture movement, the lingering effects of the May the 4th movement, continued to grow GMD support. Okay, so the GMD now has more of a platform to launch an uprising and present, real challenge to the warlords. So we can see down here, okay, this is the provinces that I'm talking about, okay? This area down here is where the GMD kind of power base was, okay? As you will know from looking at the warlord tutorial, all these other areas are carved up by provincial leaders, okay, who belong to different cliques, and they fought between themselves for their own expansion, their own kind of self-interest, and did very little during this time to actually improve the situation of China at all. And so this area down here, okay, becomes the kind of power base for the GMD through the 1920s. Okay, and you can see here Sun Yat-sen with his leading counterpart of Chiang Kai-shek, who would become, after Sun Yat-sen's death, the leader of the GMD. During his time in Guangzhou, Sun Yat-sen writes a lot about revolution, about the future of Chinese Republic, about what the methods, what the GMD needs to do in order to bring about a new republic based on the principles of democracy. And he writes in 1918 about the 3 stages of revolution. And this is interesting to have a look at, okay, the lenses of what we see China and what period we see China at. So he says the first stage is complete destruction. Okay, we have martial law, we have revolutionary army taking over, we have the eradication of corruption. Opium was a major issue, and we have system of exterminate the system of slave girls, depraved customs. Okay, are completely kind of destroyed. So you can think about this period as the early period of Yuan Shikai's rule, okay, where we really have this period of complete destruction, the complete removal of the old dynasty, and in doing so, okay, a real focus on reforming China. The next stage is this transitional period, okay, where we have the provisional constitution come into effect, and local self-government is promoted. So China, you might say, never really gets there because they never really form a clear constitution. There are problems in the constitution. Sun Yat-sen writes his own in 1912, but then that is replaced by Yuan Shikai's constitution in 1914. And so some warlords support the 1912 constitution, some warlords support the 1914 constitution. So there's no real clarity on the political organization of China at this stage. And also the people kind of very much lack an understanding of what their political rights are. China has been for thousands of years under imperial rule. All they know is kind of an authoritarian government. They don't know anything about democracy or what their rights and what their liberties should be. So Sun Yat-sen really encourages what's known as political tutelage. You need to start to develop people's understanding of democracy to try to help them to make informed decisions. And then what he envisions is this period of the third stage, a period of reconstruction, in which we have a constitutional government is introduced, we have a self-governing body, and people start to exercise their own political rights. Okay, this is what you might say is to become in the future. Okay, and China at this stage is really stuck in this kind of transitional period, very much kind of locally organized. Okay, still quite a high degree of disorder, fragmentation, no kind of central authority, and there's no kind of clarity with the political organization of China at this time. And he advocates again and again for a republican government, okay? And he compares it, use the metaphor, just as a boy needs school, okay? He says that, just as students need good teachers, the Chinese people need good teachers. They need to teach them how to exert their democratic rights. They need political tutelage, okay? And this political tutelage is necessary for the transition from a monarchy to a republic. If this doesn't happen, which is what the warlord period definitely kind of shows, is disorder will be unavoidable. And this is the disorder that we see in this period from 1916 to 1926, this period, this warlord era of complete disorder. And so you might say, okay, well, a key reason for the failure of Sun Yat-sen in this period is the fact that he's unable to, spread his message. He's unable to gain broader support. He's unable to go about his policy of political tutelage for the people. It is during this time, though, okay, that he starts to formulate the ideology of the GMD, and this would become the basis for the Nationalist Party. Okay, Nationalist Party, which is still in power in Taiwan, still has its roots with the GMD. And he bases it on the Gettysburg Address from Abraham Lincoln. And this becomes the ideology of the GMD, okay? So the Gettysburg Address is during the American Civil War, in which Abraham Lincoln says, okay, we need to have a government which is going to be built of the people, by the people, for the people. And so the new kind of principles for the GMD would be national sovereignty, democracy, so this idea of by the people, and people's welfare. Okay, so for the people, that would be focusing on their livelihood. And national sovereignty, okay, obviously of the people. It would be based on the Chinese nationalism. So there's a lot of similarities between this, okay? China, America at this time is starting to form its own nation. They're starting to look at their own their own framework, okay? What is going to be the basis for their own constitution back in 1863. So there's a lot of comparisons between the China of 1920s and America during the Civil War. And so what does he say with regards to these three principles? Okay, how does he come about them? So they're built about by a fusion of different ideas. He doesn't advocate for the complete destruction of traditional ideas. So as you may have read when we looked at the New Culture movement, people like Chen Jiuxiu, who becomes a founding member of the Communist Party, calls for a complete eradication of old customs, of old traditions. Anything that ties us back to the Chinese dynasty should be destroyed. More moderate, okay, less kind of revolutionary reforms, okay, are advocated by members like Hu Su, who says that we need drop-by-drop revolution, okay? Slow incremental change, slow incremental reform, which would acknowledge our traditions, which would acknowledge our history, but also lay a clear platform for the future of China, okay? And so you can see that Hu Su would become a leading member of the Nationalist Party. Chen Jiuxiu would become a leading member of the more radical Communist Party. And so Sun Yat-sen follows that kind of principles, or he established that principles in saying that, okay, well, we need elements of our traditional ideas, a fusion of European theory, and his own experience. And obviously he gains a huge amount of experience from traveling throughout the world, during his period. We've already looked at, okay, his travels in America, in Europe, in Japan, throughout Southeast Asia, and his own kind of original and self-developed theories that come about through his own learning and his own experience. And so the principle of nationalism is to be focused on the independent spirit of China. And this is focused on building a sovereign state. Maintaining independence is a critical element. Remember at this time, China had signed up for multiple foreign loans. Okay, they had been imposed upon by the 21 demands of Japan. They had not been given the province of Shandong after the Treaty of Versailles. And so the independence of China is still being encroached upon by foreign powers. It also called for a spread of our indigenous civilization as a way to enrich it and absorb what's the best in the world as well. So looking at how can we, keep true to our traditions of what makes us Chinese, whilst also bringing in these kind of, and absorbing these modern sort of ideas that are circulating throughout the world, during the early 21st century. And the idea is this goal of brotherhood, okay, of forming, diplomatic relations with other democracies to try to, build a modern state. The concept of democracy is slightly different in a Chinese view as it is in a Western view. So although Sun Yat-sen calls for the creation of a republic, he says that a constitutional monarchy will be an impossibility. And the focus of a democracy is not necessarily about personal freedom or kind of focusing on the self. It's much more about the collective and looking at how we can come together to form a collective democratic body, as opposed to focusing on our own kind of self-interest. So it's much more kind of a shared kind of focus on democratic principles as opposed to something that's focused on the individual. And he says that in order to do this, we firstly need to establish a constitution, and that constitution needs to have a separation of powers. It needs to have legislative, judicial, and executive powers, and these need to be separated in order to have checks and balances on the democratic system. The same as how many democratic systems around the world have these systems in order to make sure that no power is too centralized into the body of a few people. The last one is focusing on livelihood. And very similarly to democracy, this is focused on collective livelihood, not on self-interest, not on individuals. And he says that what he sees in the world in the early 21st century is a kind of a plague of inequality. And during the early 21st century, we've had a world war, we've had revolution, we've got furthering modernization of countries around the world, and we have continued industrialization. This continues to create further gaps between rich and poor. And he says that China is no different. The degree of inequality is the only change. The character of inequality is no different to what we see in other nations around the world. And you might say that because China hasn't necessarily industrialized that heavily, there actually hasn't been the same degree of inequality that we see in countries like Great Britain or in Russia during the same period. And so what he advocates for with livelihood is a focus on collective responsibility for everyone. And he does this through state ownership. And this is, he says, is the most profound, reliable, and practical way of improving people's lives. So you might say, well, isn't Sun Yat-sen kind of a nationalist? Should he be, promoting kind of democratic ideas based on like capitalism and, the idea of like self-interest and competition? The ideas of state ownership seem very kind of communist or more socialist in their kind of leanings. And you're exactly right. These are kind of drawn from elements of socialism. And you can see that Sun Yat-sen has very much a fusion of different ideas. He's not focused on private capital. He's focusing on, government capital, on state capital. That is his main focus. If we develop these things, there's going to be an infrastructure in place to support all people. And so he fuses that with nationalism, with democracy. This is the way to kind of stop economic unrest. So these principles are pivotal. They become a practical program for national reconstruction. They get used to kind of underpin all of the policies that the GMD is going to do, in this period and also in later periods as well. So make sure, when we look at the Nationalist Party and nationalist rule under Chiang Kai-shek, make sure you keep in the back of your mind that all of these policies should be rooted in the three principles of the people. As we look in later lessons, we can think about, well, does Chiang Kai-shek act in accordance with these rules, or is he following his own principles? Has he lost, the clarity of what the three principles of the people should be and what the foundation of the GMD is meant to be in the first place? Many historians say that he doesn't act in accordance with, what Sun Yat-sen had envisioned China to become. It emphasized the conditions, not the individuals, okay? Focused on the collective, solving the issues, not focusing on, putting particular people into power. Restated the importance of ending foreign dominance and reasserting China's independence. And these were the vital first steps in helping, China to solve its problem of backwardness, okay, of disorder, of fragmentation. And it provided a unifying moral purpose, okay? And that's a powerful tool for an emerging political party, is the fact that they now not only have a clear ideology, but it's based on a future that's based in kind of morality. It's based on what they regard as right for their people and what they think is going to be, a good future for China. So during the 1920s, okay, the GMD continues to develop, and probably one of the key elements, okay, remember we spoke about earlier, is the fact that the GMD doesn't have, an army. It doesn't have a broad range of troops. It's still dependent on, external support. It's still dependent upon warlords. They use triads very early, organized crime in order to present opposition to warlords. And so they need to establish a military academy in order to train the GMD recruits. And it's exactly what they do. Okay, they establish the Whampoa Military Academy, and this is the first modern military training academy in China. And it's established in 1924 in order to train the GMD troops. And you can see here at the opening ceremony, we see Dr. Sun Yat-sen, okay, and Chiang Kai-shek, who was appointed the commandant of the Whampoa Academy. And as a result of this, the GMD became a military organization. And it led to the growth of the party in establishing further military strongholds in Nanjing and Chengdu. Sun Yat-sen continues to write on what this new democracy, what this new republic is to look at. And he says that in order to have a kind of strong democracy, you need to have a separation of powers. It needs to be divided into two parts. The hands of the people need to have, the majority of control. They should have a full degree of sovereignty. They should be able to make decisions, to be able to vote freely in order to elect, representatives who represent their aims. And what they do is they obviously then elect a governing power who will manage all of the nation's business. So the governing power is in the hands of the people. Not the other way around. Okay, so this is, the idea, from the Gettysburg Address, okay, of the people, for the people, by the people, and in the, three principles of the people, democracy is central to this. And in order to have a democratic state, Sun Yat-sen advocates for four key principles. The first one is suffrage. This is the right to vote. You may have heard this, term being used with the idea of, female suffrage. Women still could not vote in China at this time. It still takes quite a long time for them for women's suffrage. But he's talking about all males having the right to vote. The right of recall, okay, the right of calling back officials who maybe haven't fully finished their term to elect new ones who represent their aims. So the officials, their power is in the hands of the people, okay? Their continued political career is in the hands of the people. The last one is initiative. There's two more. Initiative is the third one. And this is focusing on the idea that people can propose things to the government. They themselves, although the people, again, the ordinary people are not in power, they have the initiative to go and tell their local representatives what they want. So they have the initiative. They have the kind of the formulation of political kind of policies. And the last one is referendum. And this is a way of amending any law, okay, to do away with old laws, okay? So we can call a referendum, okay, and it kind of ties in with the idea of suffrage. All people have a right to vote, and so they can all see, okay, what the new China is to become. In 1924, so despite obviously all of the circulation and discussion, okay, further writing, further clarification of the ideology, the establishment of the kind of the military arm of the GMD, Sun's health, okay, and the kind of continued kind of prevalence of the warlords means that Chinese reunification has not yet come about. He begins talks because of this, okay, with national regional leaders, okay, around China, trying to gain further support. He travels up to Beijing, okay, and he tries to gain support within the warlords and external support in order to build and to get rid of the Beiyang clique and those who would oppose him. He sought the removal of the warlords, okay, and Sun built a force and support and sought external support in order to form a superior central authority. He wants to unify China back together. And in order to do this, he actually turns to the Communist Party, which is an emerging party after the May the 4th movement, as a result of the New Culture movement, very similar to the GMD, who have very different political ideologies. Chen Jishu, advocating for, armed revolution, for significant, reform and changes, radical changes to China. But he admired the structure and the discipline of the Bolshevik Party. And he takes a lot of inspiration from the 1917 revolution and the fact that that was successful. And he saw a common ground between their revolutionary program. He said, you want the end of the warlords, I want the end of the warlords. Let's work together in order to do this. And so what he does is he starts to respond to the overtures by the Communist Party. And this is something that we're going to look at a bit later on as well, but I just want to introduce it now. And he signs an agreement with Joff, who is the foreign affairs minister in Russia during this time. And Joff is working in very close kind of relations with the Communist Party, the emerging Communist Party in China. And they're saying that, we really advocate for you to join with the nationalist forces. At the moment, the Communist Party is too small in order to be able to stand by itself. So get some support from other revolutionary groups like the Nationalist Party. With combining your two parties, you might be able to bring about the end of the warlords. And we can see here what is signed in their agreement. He says that the communist organization, the Soviet system, cannot be adopted in China. And this is going to become critical later on. The reasoning behind this is the fact that the Bolshevik system relied, and the Soviet system relied on a working class, an industrial working class who were aware and kind of politically kind of motivated. At this period of time, China does not have any working class. They have, 80% of the population is peasantry. They don't have any working class at all because they haven't industrialized. And so the Bolsheviks, following their model, all they know is their own experiences. And they say, you don't have what we have. You don't have necessarily the ingredients in order to bring about revolution just yet. So why don't you, try to industrialize first, and then you might be able to actually have, a communist revolution. And so China doesn't have the conditions in order to bring about this yet. But the key focus for both parties is the unification of the republic and the completion of national independence. They both want sovereignty, nationalism, a unified China. And so Russia provides them with assistance and support. They say that you can rely on our assistance and support in order to do this. And so they arm the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, and they arm the Nationalist Party as well to go against the warlords, which is what we're going to look at during the First United Front in our next lecture. And so he also clarifies that Russia has no intention of their kind of imperialist desires over Outer Mongolia. And Sun says that you should continue to hold on to this area because there's lots of white forces. This is during the time of the Civil War, who was going against the Communist Party. The whites were opposed to the Reds, which is the Communist Party. It said continue to hold on to it because we are not able to fight against those white forces in Outer Mongolia yet. So you're okay. You can continue to hold on to that area because we're going to be unable to prevent any hostile actions against you because we can't stop them in our own area. And so that's really interesting in the fact that Sun Yat-sen is very much willing. His focus is on the revolution. He doesn't care how it comes about. He doesn't care necessarily about his own kind of power. He is, starting to become an old man. He's, getting quite unwell. And so his main focus is on revolution. It's on unifying China. He wants to see before his death, I'm sure, the reunification of China and finally a Chinese republic being formed. Unfortunately, he dies before that could happen. So it's, obviously very sad. So his overall role, he's very much limited by the nature of Chinese politics and the fact that there hasn't been a huge amount of political tutelage. People do not know about democracy. People do not know about their own rights. They don't know how a republic functions. They don't know about the constitution. And Sun Yat-sen, you might say, is very much limited because he can't gain a broad support, amongst the warlords. Also, his message is very limited to the southern provinces. So he has a power base there, but he's unable to kind of spread that, throughout China. But what he did do is he provided a national platform for the GMD party through the three principles of the people. This would be the foundational ideology of this group, provide a moral basis for continued revolution and uprising. He sought the reconstruction of China by any means necessary, signing with communists, working with Japanese, uniting kind of pan-Asian kind of nationalist groups. Anything that would see China become unified is what Sun Yat-sen was willing to do. And continually, he advocated for against foreign domination. Okay, advocated for Chinese sovereignty, for Chinese independence, and this was at the core of the nationalist message during the 1920s and 1910s. So although you might say he wasn't necessarily successful because he dies before the nationalist government is actually installed, he is pivotal in providing a framework and providing the basis for the revolution and the eventual rise to power of the Nationalist Party in the later 1920s. And that's what we're going to look at in future lessons. Our next tutorial is going to be on the Communist Party. So we've obviously looked at the formation of the Nationalist Party. We're going to now rewind and we'll look at how after the New Culture movement, the ideas that have spread in there, how does that then formulate the early workings of the Communist Party? And then we'll look at how these two groups come together, both revolutionary, both wanting the same thing, and how they form the first united front. And we're going to finally see the end of the warlords. So please make sure that you like, subscribe. Please feel free to add any comments or any questions that you have about today's tutorial in the comment box. And I will see you in a future lesson.